Good evening. Hope you've had a good week and appreciate your being with us. Quick review. We talked about four things for us to think about in terms of working with our kids. Anybody help me? P is pray. And like I said, we were second semester Oklahoma Christian, had a school retreat, and Stanley Ship said, rather than waiting till your kids are teenagers and worrying about them, start praying for them right now. And that was probably the spring of 71. And as in-laws, two son-in-laws, daughter-in-law came in our family. I've told them I've prayed for you on 747s at 37,000 feet across the Pacific. I prayed for you on ferries. I prayed for you in fishing tubes. Didn't know who you were. And that's something for us to be thinking about, is just to be prayerful. And our thinking is obviously pray for ours and then pray for potential people that they'll meet and get to know from there. Got some, yeah, can you help with the ones that can, if you came in to get a handout, sorry, let's make sure we get one. So P is prayerful, and I think that's something that we just do kind of all the way through. I, intentional, be really specific about what we're doing. And again, my term is fingerprints of faith. I haven't mentioned this before. This is really kind of crazy, but my great-grandmother got married in Nebraska at 14 years and 9 months in the 1800s. And in 1901, she's the wise old age of 18 and gets on a train with 3 boys, 4 and under, and comes to Indian Territory. There used a place called Doxie east of Sayre, and the train went from Doxie to Nebraska. And so she came to Indian Territory at 18 with 3 boys. It was too late to build a house, and so out by the truck stops on the east side of Sayre, they dug a dugout in the side of the hill. They killed one of their animals, skinned for a door, and they spent the first winter in Indian Territory in a dugout with 3 little boys, 4 and under. If we slept on shale rock all winter, we'd all die of pneumonia or something worse. Anyway, raised 6 kids, but she loved to study the Bible. And so at 85, she's 75 when I'm born. At 85, I walk her home from church 2 blocks. She's on a cane. I nearly have to trot to keep up with her. We'd eat lunch, and then she'd sit down, have a good book in her lap. That's the term. She'd look me straight in the eye and quote the entire book of James and turn the page at the right time. And then she'd turn over to Philippians and quote the book of Philippians. And then it might be the Sermon on the Mount. Commercial break. Son, I'm going to start in Malachi and you start in Genesis. And I'll say the books of the Old Testament backwards, faster than you can say them forward, ready, go. And she'd beat me on that. And then she might quote Galatians. This would go for 2 hours. So here you are, 10 years old, looking an 85-year-old great-grandmother in the eye, and she turns the good book at the right page and never looks down at it and quotes scripture to you for over 2 hours. Another commercial break. She starts in Revelation. I started Matthew. She beat me there, so she's beat me twice. And then the grand finale, then we do this all backwards. And then she'd say, now, son, listening to sermons and going to class is like playing basketball. You use both hands and you go both ways. The preacher doesn't start at the front of the Bible and go back, and when he announces a verse, I want you to be there before he gets there, and I want you to know something about it. Now, 85 years old. What is she doing? Fingerprints of faith. We all are going to have different abilities. We're going to have different aptitudes, different things, and we'll start talking some about specific devotionals tonight. But for all of us, and I'm thinking again, children, grandchildren, and Lord willing, if we live long enough, great-grandchildren, and be thinking as long as we're a part of this process, we want to be prayerful and intentional. C is consistent. And especially when our kids at home, they love routine. Our smaller kids, we would do this every night before we went to bed. And my mom read to us out of, I can't say this very well, Hurlbut, Hurlbut's Bible story. This is my earliest childhood memory. My mother had a blue terry cloth robe, and older sister, 5 years older, myself, younger sister. And then she brought this thing home called a younger brother. And we all had our routine and everything was good. And when Kent came home, everything got messed up and nothing has changed since then. So if you know my little brother, Ken Hartman, you know exactly what I'm talking about. He came in the world stirring the pot and just has kept everybody on their toes. But that's my earliest childhood memory, is that Mom read to us every night. We gathered around, had this blue terry cloth robe, and where do we put him? You know, because we all had a routine, and then he comes home, and so but in that, again, what am I talking about? Fingerprints of faith. And I'm going to encourage especially dads to do that. But in our family, our mom read to this, and so it was intentional, consistent. K, knowing God. And this whole term about God being our Father and the relationship with that is something that's very, very significant and important. I didn't have time to do this, and I didn't want to just start on something too quickly. So we're still going to stay with, and again, for those who are here, our thinking is 1 to 6, we're going to work on their hearts. And yes, I know it's a pump, but you know what I'm trying to say. And so, like, for example, with our grandchildren, every time can I use the word term lay hands on, you know what I'm saying? Chuck is a walking jungle gym with his grandkids. When they were little, they crawled all over him. He hugged them. There's just all this, and we're going to talk about this word, appropriate contact. And every time I can physically lay hands, let's go do something, let's do this, then I have a very specific, I know exactly what I'm doing. It doesn't matter what our activity is. So our little people from 1 to 6, then we're doing heart, we're working on attitude, we're working on our emotions, those relationship type things. And I want you to think about something. How many languages do kids in Europe learn to speak by the time they're 7 or 8 years old? It's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? But if you've been around, a lot of kids know 2 or 3 languages by the time they're in early grade school. How did they do that? Did they give them a 3x5 card and say, here's a vocabulary? No, they exposed them to those things. They were developed. That was an ongoing part of the thing. And I'm just thinking, you think about all the things that kids can learn when they're small. Why can't we be intentionally putting fingerprints of faith on them and trying to win their heart for God? We'll move in a little bit to 7 through 12 is head. And I have very specific things we're working on, but we're talking about, well, just life and how you look at things, how you sort things out. What did you see? God's creation, and everything we can do to bring spiritual things to their head is what we're going to do. And then 13 through 18, try to combine our attitude, try to combine what we think with, here are things we can do to serve God. And so that's very simple, but I like things that aren't complicated, but are very specific. And so still with grandchildren, every time I get a chance to be with them, then I have that target when I'm doing that. If I have your children for any occasion, like for example, we were at Eastside for 41 years and all. The first 12 we were in Australia, but we knew people and came and went. But for years, while I was preaching at Eastside, if I could take any of the high school boys with me on Wednesday night to be a visiting service, it's exit 105. Just past the river going toward Weatherford. Is it Hinton? Hydro. And we went on a Wednesday night to a church there, and we had 4 or 5 guys, and I said, we're going to do 3 things tonight. One, when you get ready to leave home, and at some point you may live somewhere else, if you were visiting this church to see if this might be a church home, what are you going to notice and look at tonight when you meet these people you've never met before? 2, if there's anybody in the youth group, then I want you to reach out to them, to talk with them, and encourage them. And I don't want us to be spectators. I want us to go and be participants. And this is going to be talking about the hands later. And then 3, I want us just to think about all the people in the congregation. And so Anytime you take 3 or 4 high school boys and you stop and get a really good meal and then you go do something like that, and then here came all this interaction of things like that. Well, the church we went at, there was one 14-year-old boy there that night. Okay, Jake, what it would be like if you're in a church and you're the youth group on Wednesday night? What did you guys talk to him about? How did you reach out and encourage him? If you were looking at this church, you were transferred here, looking for a new church home, see, what are we talking about? Activity, hands, and things like that. And then who else did you encourage while you were here? And so, see what I'm talking about? Attitude, thinking, activities, and that's just something that just becomes second nature of the things that we're trying to do. Chuck, come up right quick. How many years did you work in a gym and work with elementary kids?
21.
21. Okay. He was ruined forever. He and Norm did football. Their first quarterback was some guy named Mike Gundy in elementary school, and their second quarterback was some guy named Cale Gundy. Anybody get it? Yeah. Starting quarterback for Cowboys, starting quarterback for the Sooners are their first 2 quarterbacks in grade school. They're ruined for the rest of their life because Chuck said we can do stuff in grade school that junior high teams can't do with those guys, but he worked with kids all the time. And Chuck had a statement about a sponge. You remember what this is? Chuck says, if you pour water on a sponge, this one's new, so it's not going to soak up very well. But what happens if the sponge gets full?
It runs off.
It runs off. So if you're working with little kids, what was your philosophy about teaching and working with a sponge and with little kids?
Well, I'd always say each one of them are just totally different than the other, and each one is a little bit different shape or size of a sponge. And some accept that information really well and some not so much. So sometimes you have to work with that sponge a little bit more than you do the others. And the thing that I would tell you about them is this: if I have your child from first grade through sixth grade, I don't need to go to their house. I can tell you by the look of the son or the daughter what their house life is like.
I've heard him say, I can tell by the 3rd day in the gym, the kids that come from single parent homes. Think about that. I can tell by the 3rd day of watching the kids interact in the gym who comes from single parent homes. Now, the sponge, in terms of our kids and spirituality, we can't just pour the whole dose on them. It's going to work. Sometimes you have to wring it out. Sometimes you let it dry out. And every kid's going to take it differently.
Yeah, and I would say teaching a kid is much like going to a gunfight with a 6-shooter. You don't want just one bullet in your gun. You want to have multiple bullets in your gun because every child does not learn or hear you the same way that the other child does. So I've got to find multiple ways to touch them, to massage them verbally, physically, hands-on, because not one method works for all of them. And I would have approximately 350 to 400 kids come through my class in one day. And I may have them for 6 years. And Coach Dobson would send me student teachers and I would do this. And Mark Jackson came to me and he goes, "You're the only guy that I know can look at a first grader and make them cry." And he says, "You're the only one that I know that can take that first grader, and when they leave you as a 6th grader, they cry." And I touched not only that one child, but I may have brothers and sisters and so on. And so some of my best friends are now my students that I had in elementary school and their parents that I had in elementary school. And it's very rewarding and it's very taxing and it takes a lot of work.
And for example, 5 or 6 words about your 2 boys. How different are are your two boys.
If you know Colin, he's a man of few words. And I go to work with Colin and we get out of the truck and we may not have much of a conversation all day.
They might speak 5 words before noon, and they're working together.
And Aaron gets in the truck talking, talks all day long, gets back in the truck talking, and he's talking when he gets out of the truck at the end of the day.
Someone came up the other day, they were doing a project that Aaron knew, and finally Colin told the guy, would you please leave so my brother will start working again? Because he's just been talking.
He says, as long as you stand here, he ain't gonna work, so you need to leave. And so, you know, and that's just the kids, you know, you were talking about Mike and Kale. Ray, their father, looked at me and he goes, 2 totally different guys. I coached them in elementary school and then I coached them again in high school.
In baseball.
Baseball. And Ray walked up to me today. He says, I hope you figured out that Mike is not much of a practice player, but he's a gamer. I said, yes, sir, I figured that out. And Kale, it was just totally different. Mike would beat you with his head. He would outplay you in his head, and Kale would outplay you with his hands and his feet. He's the only guy that I've ever had in elementary school as a first grader that if we had some competitive game going, I had to get involved in the game because Kale would dominate the class. I was the only one in the class that could step up and match up with him. So you have kids like that, and I have kids that are Major League Baseball players. I have kids that played in the NBA. I had kids that played in the NFL. Were collegiate players. We're all different kinds of kids. And it took me about 3 years to figure out who I was and start developing a method to touch their lives. And just like the kids would come to me and I could tell something about their parents, the kids would go home and they could tell something about Coach White. By the way, that their children talked about me in their home. And when I met them, then I would develop a relationship with them. So it's very rewarding and sometimes very challenging, if you will.
Yeah. And so be thinking about this. And that's why, like I said, I should have gotten it wet beforehand because it would have worked better. Our little kids are sponges. It's in Mark chapter 4. There's 4 parables. And when Jesus finished these, Mark says, he taught them as much as they could understand. And what I want to encourage you to do is study each of our kids as they come to us, because they're like flowers, they're like snowflakes. They're very, very different. And what works well with a nonverbal first son who would prefer not to talk doesn't work at all with a second son who processes by talking. And so with each one of them, this idea of putting fingerprints of faith is going to be an entirely different process. Okay.
We had a lady that came to our house the other day and Colin was there helping Vicky with some stuff. And she just looked at Vicky and said, well, he's not much for conversation, is he? I go, no, he doesn't discriminate either. He didn't talk to me either.
And so be thinking about it with our own children. And the process then of winning their heart for God is going to be very important. I grew up in a small town in a family that loves sports. And, you know, if you're able-bodied male in 2A, we need you to play football. Can you play basketball? Yes, please play third base in baseball, and then jump the fence and run the mile. So you're in a small school and you're needed. And you're dating and your girlfriend says, well, if your son plays the piano, will you be as interested in going to a piano concert as you would a football game? It's really easy before you have kids say, well, yes, that would be fine. But that's what happened. Our boy came along and he didn't have that interest, that knack. But I talked to Frank Davis, had been the basketball coach at Oklahoma Christian. We went to nationals and stuff. And they had basketball camp, which I came up for 3 or 4 years to that. And I talked to him as we got a little bit older, and I said, you've been a coach, you were drafted in the NBA, on and on. how have you done your sons? Because we don't want to try to relive our lives through our children. And here it came. He said, we study and listen to our children constantly, and whatever my boys are interested in, I'm going to get interested in. I may not know anything about it, but if they're interested in it, I'm going to get interested in it. And he said, one of my boys liked to play. You feed that. And he said the other one didn't have any interest in that at all. And that's something we need to do, but just be thinking again in terms of that kind of strategy. There's 2 or 3 things I want to highlight on the page that's 2.5. And I mentioned this, one of my friends in Australia, kids come to us with unlimited liability and a no return policy. And if you have a son and he gets a driver's license and you start paying car insurance, you'll have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. And your prayer life reaches a whole new level when your boys start driving as well. And this was a comment. He said, oh, our kids come to us with a no return policy and unlimited liability. Bob Rowland was an Oklahoma Christian in the 70s. Kind of talk like this. Great guy. He preached at the church out at Spencer. And he came and was talking to us one day, and he said, he said, I'd given the best lesson I'd ever given on family. I was just really proud about that. Things went really well. And he said, I was talking to a sister after church, and this lady just kind of kept standing here and standing here and standing here. And so finally we got through, and she waited for the other. She says, Brother Bob, she said, I don't know how to tell you this, but your 6-year-old son has taken all of his clothes off, and he's streaking up and down in front of the church building on the street. And I thought, since you're the preacher here, you might want to go put some clothes on him before too many people drive by. He said, you might wait till your kids get a little bit older before you talk a whole lot about family. So anyway, mine are in their 40s, so hopefully we're not going to have problems like that. But and we said this before, but it's so important. How we respond when our kids mess up is going to have a lot to do with how they relate to us as they mature and grow up. And that's something we'll put on the back burner and come back and talk about it. Proverbs 22:6 is a really important verse. And you read this and it says, train up a child in the way that they should go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. And I think this is a principle rather than a cut and dried, this is going to be the truth in every situation. I know people, families, and we mentioned this last week, Samson's parents are this way. I know parents who did everything they possibly could, and at a point in time, because they have free will, their kids have chosen to do something else. And there's just a lot of guilt, there's a lot of hurt in that regard. But one of the things that I always think about, and we just touched on this, hard to say, but still true, God has had more failure as a parent spiritually than anyone else. And when I talk with people who are just struggling with this, it says, let's keep praying for them. Maybe something will happen and they'll turn back. But when I read train up a child, and you see that little part, in the way that they should go, that's what I'm talking about. Be a student of children, grandchildren, listen to them all the time, and the things that they're interested in, that's the way that they should go. Our son was very interested in things that work. Granddad on Sheila's side, airplane pilot and mechanic. And very, very early, we did without some stuff to buy one of the early Mac computers. He was 10 years old. But we had 2 guys in Australia who had gone to England to train people, charge $3,000 to $5,000, which we could not have afforded. But this little 10-year-old kid comes up and says, I did da-da-da-da. And Steve would say, well, do da-da-da-da-da. And so in 2 years, these 2 guys taught a 10-year-old through everything that a computer could do, and that became his base language. And then we come back, he goes to Carl Albert. Something comes in the library, they're bemoaning, getting people out, and Luke just quietly said, well, I can actually install that if you don't mind. And so for the next 6 years, he installed everything that came into Carl Albert, because let's don't call the people and wait for them to come. Luke can put that in, and then came to OC and did the website for a while, did a degree in ministry, and then was asked to come back and help staff with computer things. And he's working in the IT department today, the way that he should go. Okay. Our second one, she goes to Six Flags in the 7th grade. And I say, next year, Heather, you want to go to Six Flags in Dallas? She says, oh, no, Father. She said, why go someplace when you can read a book and go someplace you've never been before? And so 12 years old, she asked for, and she's Elizabethan, Father, not NIV, I want the King James Version of the plays of Shakespeare. Okay, 12 years old. So she comes home, and over 6 months, she reads completely through the plays of Shakespeare twice. And she says, Father, I can tell you the plot, I can tell you the main characters, and I can tell you when they get knocked off. Going to Shakespeare on the Park with her on a blanket, she'll lean over and say, Father, here comes his best line in the play. Okay. Our wife and I look at each other and say, where did she come from? Not like either one of us, but that's the way that she should go. We picked up a girl from Chile and Australia. They talked in the back seat. She did Spanish, went to Mexico, was a translator at Capitol Hill for 14 years, spent a summer in Chile, the next summer in Seville, Spain, in a Spanish class, university class. And she's an immigration attorney. And all day she talks to people in Spanish. Way she could go. Our littlest one, 3rd grade, and she's her mom's girl. When I grow up, I'm going to Oklahoma Christian and studying counseling. And all along the way, it's just been just clear as a bell. And so what I want you to be thinking about with children and grandchildren, listen to them, what they're interested in. And we always want to be engaging the spiritual aspect of life. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that sometimes parents and grandparents make is trying to clone their children into their own image. And one of the things that we need to do is just kind of reverse that and say, okay, what's their interest? What's their potential? What gifts has God given them? And then work with them and try to help them in every way that we can. In the very middle of this is an older book, but the same way with these 4 things here, this has been really, really helpful. Ross Campbell had this little book on how to really love your child. And he suggested 3 things. One is eye contact. Okay, let me ask you, were you ever misbehaving at church and made eye contact with your mother? Nothing has to be said. Looks can kill, can warn. But you stop and think about it. Some children very seldom, if nearly never, have anybody look them in the eye. Okay, I've had a couple of knee surgeries. I can't do this as much, but as long as I've been able, if your child comes at church, coming out the back and comes talk to him, I'm going to drop down on one knee, literally, and get down and try to, because you think about it, if you try to look at people like this all the time, and what happens if an adult literally drops down and makes eye contact with you? She was 3 years old. Her name is Brianna. And my name was Big Hug. Okay. Couldn't lose 70 pounds and become Skinny Hug. That didn't have the same attraction to it. And she would not leave church until we had a hug. And she's now married and has a child. And every time I see her, guess what? We had to have a hug. But 3 years old, every time I saw her coming, then dropped down to literally make eye contact with them. And what's this? Some children, the only time they have eye contact is when they're in trouble. And one of the things that's really helpful in terms of we're talking about nurturing and value and just this studying and learning about them, eye contact really, really critical. The second one, and this is a big hobby of mine, so I won't do this long, focused attention. Sorry, I can't even hardly process this very well. I can't tell you how often I've seen a mom with 2 or 3 small children and they're eating and you fill in the blank, Chick-fil-A or something. And what's mom doing? She's on her phone, texting or talking to someone else. And I just want to go over, I'm not going to do this literally, okay? But I just want to kind of shake her and say, they didn't come to stay, they came to leave. They're not going to be here very long. And I'm really convinced of this. If I don't listen to them when they're little people, why should they listen to me when they get to be bigger people? And sometimes it's just da 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 da. But see, there's a certain sense of value that they receive if, as parent, as an adult, as coach, you really listen to them. And so how to really love your child, eye contact, focused attention. And then the third one's appropriate touch. When we had our devotionals at night, either we held them or we laid down on the floor and we kind of crawled around each other. And that's so important from the point of view that, and again, we're talking about appropriate, but I've had a number of teachers say, especially for us guys who have girls, if we're not hugging them as they grow up, someone else will be. And father's appropriate touch is very important, but it's also true with our boys. And those three things are his suggestions about how to really love your child. And again, for those of us that are grandparents, still very appropriate. And those of us who have kids, and I just encourage you, really work on those three things when you're with them. Make as much eye contact as you can. And then secondly, focused attention, listen very, very carefully, ask questions that engage them, talk about things they're interested in. And then the third one's appropriate touch. Now, this is a personal thing, and just kind of weigh this out. Well, let me just say it this way. If we have two girls, here's two of you together. If you two go dress shopping and you watch this, when two girls go out and they're shopping, whatever, a lot of times girls talk to each other face to face. Even when they're shopping, they'll look at something and what do you think about this? And you watch, more often, two guys communicate side by side. Chuck, how often do you talk to your boys while y'all are working on something and looking out? Two guys go to a football game. Two guys work on a car. They do a project. And so when I'm with my girls, then I try to do as much as I can face to face, because that tends to be their natural way to communicate, and they've done that a lot more. And when I'm with my guys, and still, face to face is important, but I'm quite happy for us to do something and share something from that point of view. And everything we can do to talk with them and work with them on their level and process things that they understand is really, really important. And I encourage you to do those particular things. We're not going to do the development of children on the bottom. I want you to look at something on 2:6, and I'm just going to point these out, and you can read these later. Luke, and there's these passages about Samuel grew, John the Baptist grew, and then we're going to have Jesus. He's going to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. But under number 3 on 2:6, Luke is the only one to give a progressive development of the early life of Christ. So you have he's born. There's a different word for baby. There's a different word for little child. And then when he's 12, there's still another word for child. And then he finally calls him Jesus. And I just find this interesting. The word became flesh and dwelt among us. And Luke gives us this developmental stage of his both physical growth. And we'll be talking more about the spiritual growth later. We mentioned this, but just think about how this would work in your family. When we moved to Australia, we're 26 years old, and we had initially moved by ourselves. We worked with Australians, but there's no other Americans with us for the first 4 years. And our son's 9 months. So we're foreigners living in a whole different land and trying to enculturate and do everything. And because of that, we're different. Even when our son goes to kindergarten, he comes home and he says, "Dad, everybody in my class has figured out I talk funny." You think, bless your heart. You grew up with us and we're not Australian. And so everything our kids did, they were different. Every time they opened their mouth, they're different. And so one of the things we talked about, and starting on Saturday, and both of us, Sheila was really good with this, Sunday's the best day of the week. We had devotionals every night. And in our case, we read from this wonderful Jesus Friend of Children. Like I said, a later edition is the Big Picture book. And we wore out 2 of them. But every night we did this. And again, just look at this. Isn't that a fantastic picture for a 4 or 5-year-old to be looking when you're reading about the story of the cross? And there's just these fantastic pictures in that. And this was a part of our routine, a part of our things. And we'll talk a little bit more about other things we worked on. But we did that every day. And then Saturday, we'd start saying, tomorrow's the best day of the week. Because we get to go be with our spiritual family. We get to go do things like that. And all the things built up to what we do on Sunday with our spiritual family. This is the best day of the week. We had something special for breakfast. I tried to help get the kids ready. We worked on that when they were little. But again, what are we working on? Heart, attitude. And that was something that we tried to cultivate from the very, very beginning. On 2:7, if you'll just notice that, and then we're going to do something totally different here for just a second. One of the things that we try to do with our kids is to have things for us to do with other people at church when we come to church. Now, we're in a smaller church, but like, for example, we sometimes would ask a widow lady to sit with us, or we would bring cards to give to people. And if I am a participant when I come to services, I have a whole different experience than if I'm just a spectator. Let me go all the way to the senior end, but just to show the same thing. We had a dear friend who had preached all of his life and couldn't for physical reasons. But he said, when I go to church, I'm going to lay hands on 6 fathers and encourage them to be the best dads and fathers that they can be. He said, I go to worship, I go to the lesson, but I specifically go to encourage the people there. Hebrew writer, do not give up attending as the habit of some is, but as you see the day approaching, what are you to do? Stir one another up to love and good works. And so we try to encourage our kids to do something with other people when they come to church, and not just be spectators, but to be participants. How many of you teach like lower classes at church, Bible classes and things? Okay. How many letters have you gotten from your kids who you're teaching their class while you're teaching the class saying, thank you for teaching my class? Anybody gotten one? But do you see what I'm saying? At the stage and age that they are, wouldn't it be appropriate for our kids to pick out a card to say, hey, we want to say thank you to our teacher. We want to say thank you to our elders. We want to say thank you to that. And since my kids are only going to be with me a short period of time, and they're going to spend the majority of their life as adults, what can I do to create an attitude that, yes, worship is and being with God's people is the best day of the week, but we're not going to come and just be spectators. We're going to come to encourage, to help, and do things with other people. And I have a whole different attitude about that. Okay? Thankfully, this has only happened 3 times. I'm sure people have thought this more often than that, but 3 times I've had someone come out and say, I think you're the worst preacher I've ever heard in my life. And I congratulate them on their perceptiveness. I'm not going to change their mind. I'm not going to fight with them. You know, most people aren't as perceptive as you are, and I'm sorry that that was difficult for you. But do you know, James said, the trying of your faith work with patience, and let patience have its good work. So I hope, even though it was a struggle for you to be here, that you develop some character today while you listen to the worst preacher that you could hear today. And see, our attitude toward people says an awful lot. And everything we can do to encourage people. I mentioned this last week. We go down to Port Isabel over Memorial Day. It's a small church of about 30. Sometimes half of them are gone. And whatever they're doing, we're going to do. If they go to Dairy Queen on Sunday night, we're going to go to Dairy Queen. If they have potluck, whatever that little church is doing. And when we come in, Rusty then, I mentioned this, Rusty says, Michael, first prayer, David, Lord's Supper, Luke, close prayer, Mr. Hartman, leading singing tonight. And our pictures are on the membership board because they said, we talk to you when the snowbirds come, and you guys check on us during hurricanes, see how we're doing. We check on you in tornadoes. And so when we go to this little church, we want to encourage, stir one another up to love and good works. And so everything we can do to do that is really important. The last thing on this page, and we'll touch on something later, Samuel, as a little boy, is told, speak, Lord, your servant hears. And that's just a very important thing. Can we pass out one more sheet real quick? And we won't get through all of this, but I want to make the transition to. Thank you. When we look at the stage from 7 to 12, primary examples for the little bitty ones are going to be obviously Samuel and other people that are there we'll talk about. But Jesus has been our example for the thinking and the head part. And as you get this, and I'll just read, but you'll get it when you come. Jesus grew. And you look back and you hear the echo of Samuel. Samuel grew. John the Baptist grew. And so he didn't just come into the world fully God. This is the human side. He is going to grow and going to develop. And so at 12, our example is Jesus. And so my target with our kids was, and if you look at number 2 at the very top, he's sitting in the temple courts. Okay, we're in Luke 2. Ladies, how would you be for 3 days that you don't know where your son is? Most moms are not going to be coping very well if it's been 3 days and you haven't been able to find your son. I would love to hear the tone of Mary's voice when she says, "Son, where have you been?" And what does he say? "Mom, didn't you know I need to be in my father's house about my father's business?" And here are the 3 markers for me for my kids from 7 to 12. He is sitting, in this case, among the teachers. He is listening to them, and he's asking them questions. And I just want you to think about this. How many 12-year-olds can sit? And Chuck's had kids who just can't sit. Even junior high, it's just a struggle to get them to, either just hyper or doing stuff all the time. So with my kids, because we're going to be training and working with them all along the way. We're going to learn to do this, and we're going to learn to listen to adults. And sometimes kids are so much in a kid's world, they can't even interact with adults at all. And we want them to be kids. But at 12, he's able to sit, he's able to listen, and he's able to ask them questions. And I had to be about my father's business in my father's house. And then here's a very important word. He was obedient to them. And we're going to find obedience all through his adult life. And one of the things that Joseph and Mary helped him to learn as a child, I think before he is baptized and has the fullness of the Son of God, was to be obedient to physical father. One of my favorite verses in John 8, Jesus says, "I always do what pleases him." And it's easier for our kids to learn to please a father that they haven't seen if they've learned to obey a father that they have seen. But here's the things: wisdom, stature, favor with God, and favor with man. So what we have is that Jesus is being taught God's word from the time that he's small, so that by the time he's 12, he can interact with people. And can I say, he brings things to the discussion. So what we try to do in our family devotionals, and it was a story, but because I had them every day, this was our mark. We had them actually about 5 or 6. We had a keyword for every book in the Bible, every major character, and so that if they're in your class, they bring something about the Bible story when they come to class. Okay, and so when I'm with my little bitties, I made 6 trips to the state fair this year with grandkids, and a part of it is coming or going. We're going to be talking about our questions, we call them. Genesis is a book of beginnings, and when you hear Exodus, think of the word exit. They exited out. When you hear Leviticus, you hear Levi. The trying of your faith worketh patience. And Levi was a priest, holiness, numbers. The people are wandering in the wilderness, and God numbers them. Deuteronomy is 2. And so we have a story. And so with my grandkids and all the little ones, then we're working through so they know every character. I chose for them to learn the 12 sons of Jacob. And you say, okay, why would you do that? Well, they're going to become the what? The 12 tribes. And when you read nearly all the prophets, the majority of them will say, in the days of Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Amnon. And so if you know that, then you got that. And then we learned the kings of Judah. And it's really easy. You just do a 3x5 card and you start Reuben. So that's the sons. You start Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa. And then you do those, and then you add, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Uzzah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. Manasseh, Amnon, Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And again, I maintain if European kids can learn 3 languages by the time they're 8, why can't our kids learn to walk through the Bible by the time they're 12? And a lot of it is a positive expectation. And you don't have to be a Bible scholar or genius to have it on a card and work with it. And so we had very specific things, and we're going to talk about this term, structured things that we did. And then as you go on the way, we moved our kids from a school so they could be with Chuck, Heather's 6th grade, and Annalisa's 5th and 6th grade year. We drove 20 miles a day round trip so our kids could be with Chuck. And what a great opportunity for them to be that. But what do I get to do from the house till we get to school? We're going to talk about our questions and do that. And as we go, things will happen. And the prayer for our girls was, God, please help our Baptist friends believe their Bible today before they believe their pastor. And knowing Heather, you know what the discussions were and the talk that came back and forth. And that was something that we were able to talk about and to do. So when you look at number 3, and this is something we talked about our kids, and again, we're the 7 through 12, decide I'm going to be about my Father's business, or I'm going to be worshiping in my Father's house. I'm going to fill my life with spiritual things. I'm going to do what pleases him. And here's Jesus. He went about doing good in the kingdom. I'm going to be obedient, favor. And so these are things we talked with our kids, specifically 7 to 12. We're going to be like Jesus. And so by the time you're 12, he's our benchmark to be able to do that. If you'll turn to the back, I'll leave you to read these things that are there. Final trip, comparisons in the life of Jesus as a child and as an adult, interaction with children. But then when you look at the bottom, even though he were a son, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. And the same boy who learned to be obedient to Joseph and Mary, as he matures and grows, learns to be obedient to a heavenly Father. And so Jesus is our benchmark. Okay? So we're talking about Samuel when he's little. Speak, Lord, your servant here for our heart, 1 to 6, 7 through 12. Then we said when we're 12 years old, we want to have Jesus, the friend of children. I'll do this real quick and we'll be going. On the very bottom of this 2-7 that was there, Lynn McMillan brought 3 OC campaigns while we were living in Sydney. And I'm guessing Annalise is, 4 or 5. And, the students are coming. And I promise you, if you keep 4 college females for a month, your hot water heater goes when you take them to the airport to be able to leave. So there's 5 of us living there, and then you have 4 college girls living with you for a month. We had times we'd have 100 people a month through our house. The H for the Hilton. Heather said we run the Hartman Hotel instead of the Hilton. We had people in all the time. So here's Annalise, and she's about this big, going to be our counselor. She says, Father, do you think Lynn McMillan is going to heaven? And I'm thinking, where on earth did this come from? I said, sweetheart, but he's coming in a few days. I don't think anything about it. So we go pick up Lynn and Joy, pick up the college students. We're unpacking stuff. And I come around the corner, and here's Lynn on the couch. And this 5-year-old little girl is not only sitting on his lap, she has put her arms around his neck, and she's right here. Now, if you know Lynn, he's really good with the counselor not showing emotion and not, you can say anything you want to, and Lynn won't react. He's been very trained to doing that. And I just have to listen. Mr. McMillan, do you think you're going to heaven? Here's an elder, chairman of the Bible department of Oklahoma Christian. He hadn't been asked anything like that in years, and he's never had someone right here breathing on him when he asked her. And he started, and well, why? Are you sure? And she asked him about 5 or 6 questions. What's her little thing? 3rd grade. I want to be Oklahoma Christian, be a counselor. And so here she is in Lynn McMillan's lap, giving him all of this cross-examination about his faith and his life. And, is he going to, be faithful and all that stuff. And then she said, do you have any friends? He said, yes. And she says, well, are they a good influence on you? Yes. Well, who's your friend? And he said, well, my friend's James Cale. And he's trying to kind of turn things around. He says, Annalise, do you have a friend? And Annalise says, yes. My friend's name is Jesus. Do you know him? And Lynn said, can you imagine being an elder in the church, a Bible class teacher, the chairman of the Bible department at Oklahoma Christian, and you've told a 5-year-old little girl that your best friend is James Cale, and she tells you her best friend is Jesus. How did that happen? From the day she came home from the hospital, she joined the other two, and every night we read, Jesus is the friend of children. I'm going to read this as we walk out. It's on the back of 2:8. And I know we got to collect kids and stuff and we're gone, but this will be our closing thought. I took a piece of plastic clay and idly fashioned it one day. And as my fingers pressed it still, it moved and yielded at my will. I came again when days were past. A bit of clay was hard at last. The form I gave it still it bore, but I could change that form no more. I took a piece of living clay and gently formed it one day, and molded with my power and art a young child's soft and yielding heart. I came again when days were gone. It was a man I looked upon. That early impress still he bore, but I could change it nevermore. God bless. Thank you.